Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's special Red Wolf Week webinar. My name is Maggie Howell, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Wolf Conservation Center. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your control panel, and we'll provide time for questions at the end of tonight's presentation. Also, a recorded version of the webinar will be available in a day or two on the Wolf Conservation Center website. So it's a special day for red wolves. It's the 34 years ago today. It was in 1987. The first captive bred red wolves were released to the wild. 4 pairs, all born and reared in zoos or conservation centers similar to the WCC, were released in the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern North Carolina. It was among the first reintroduction efforts of a species that was considered extinct in the wild being reestablished from a captive population. And it served as a model for subsequent wolf reintroductions, including the translocation of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 1995 and 96, and the captive to wild release of Mexican gray wolves in 1998, when the endangered lobo was returned to its ancestral home in the southwestern United States. To help us celebrate today, we have Dr. Joey Hinton with us, and he'll be discussing his research on red wolves, past and present, and how it can be used to both resolve the key threats red wolves currently face, and also promote their recovery throughout their historic range. Also, next week, we'll be offering a second red wolf webinar, this one with Amy Schutt of the Canid Project, and Joey too will be there to discuss the history of red wolves in North America, and specifically looking back at their history in Louisiana and Texas. So just a little bit about Joey. He earned his PhD at the University of Georgia in 2014 and is the senior research scientist here at the Wolf Conservation Center. While at the University of Georgia, Joey oversaw a large regional study on coyotes in the southeastern United States and focused on ecology and interactions of red wolves and coyotes and ecological conditions facilitating hybridization between the two. His research is focused on the ecology, management, and conservation of wild populations with a focus on canid communities. So we're really excited to get started. So without any further ado, I'll turn the time over to Joey. Hey, Joey.
Hey, can you hear me? Just to confirm that?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. You appreciate it. And thanks for joining us, everyone. As Maggie mentioned, my name is Dr. Joseph W. Hinton. I go by Joey. And yeah, I'll be discussing a lot of my research and some of the research that's coming to the Wolf Center, and some future directions that we plan on going with this position that I have here. As you guys know, red wolves are a endangered species that requires a lot of conservation efforts to recover in its historic range. And so there's quite a bit of challenges there that the Wolf Center has with advocating for the species. But now with a research biologist there with them, we're pursuing research opportunities now to actually get on the ground and conduct meaningful science-based approaches to advocacy, I guess, and education outreach for this animal. So I'll be covering most of that today in this discussion. So just to get started, let me see if I can yep, there we go. So what I want to do is just start out big and just mention briefly some stuff about carnivore conservation. Globally, large carnivores aren't doing so well. Most of their populations are struggling, and they're at their lowest levels probably since the Pleistocene. And a lot of that has to do with anthropogenic mortality. They just do not do well in human-dominated landscapes because of conflict with human enterprises. The reason for that is that their large body size puts them at greater risk compared to other mammalian groups. If you're a big animal, like a lion or a wolf, or a cougar, you rely on large prey, usually large ungulate prey that are usually a popular game species. And so that puts you at conflict with human hunters and other interests that want to protect those populations and use them primarily for hunting reasons. The other issue too is large ungulates also struggle in human dominant landscapes, and many large ungulate species are themselves declining. And so whether it's in conflict with humans or just declining prey base, these large carnivores just struggle for that reason. The other thing too is they require extensive areas to acquire the energy they need to survive. The more space that a large animal like a wolf uses, the more likely they're going to come across roads and properties that are hunted and come in conflict with people and expose themselves to what we call mortality sources or sources of mortality, things that kill them. And so their risk is pretty high because, like I said, they have extensive space use. And because they are larger animals, their reproductive rates are usually lower. So bigger animals produce smaller litter sizes than smaller animals do, and they reproduce less frequently. And so they tend to have longer lives, and meaning that their survival is very important. They live a long time and reproduce at lower rates than, say, smaller animals like mice and stuff like that. And so when you have excessive mortality on these populations, they don't recover very well, just because they don't have the reproductive output to compensate for increased mortality. And then finally, many of these species rely on social organization to increase survival. I mean, we're going to be discussing red wolves and to some extent coyotes today, and these are pack animals, and so they rely on parental investment in offspring to increase survival and stuff like that. And so you have packs that may, get shot up or hit by cars or something like that prematurely, and so the loss of breeders causes pack disbandment and issues there where that social organization is essentially important for survival. And all these things make these animals at high risk for extinction or extirpation in these human dominant landscapes. So most of the time, conservation strategies are usually responding to anthropogenic mortality, that is human caused mortality. And they usually differ considerably from one species to the next. If you think about, red wolves in the southeastern US and compare them to gray wolf recovery in the western US, our strategies are quite different for a number of reasons. One is that we don't have a large wild population of red wolves to pull from, like Yellowstone did, right? Yellowstone, the reintroduction site there, pulled wild gray wolves from Alberta, Canada, and reintroduced them in Yellowstone. The reintroduction efforts in northeastern North Carolina relied on a captive stock of animals that had no wild experience. They were all captive-born animals. The other big difference has to do with their interactions with coyotes. Gray wolves don't hybridize with coyotes. Red wolves do. And with the colonization of most of the eastern US, if not all of it, by coyotes now, managing coyotes along with managing an endangered red wolf population is essential now. And so you're essentially doing a two-species effort to recover one. And so management looks a lot different for red wolves than it does for gray wolves. And so, like I said, conservation strategies differ quite a bit. So to get at the red wolf's susceptibility to human-caused mortality, to get at how they sort of went extinct or not extinct, but extirpated from the southeast. Again, like I mentioned, they're a large body carnivore. They required expansive areas to occupy, to hunt for white-tailed deer, which is a primary large ungulate here in the southeast, the only one, with the exception of being elk at the time, and some population of bison. And they had complex social structure, and they were highly intolerant of mortality rates. And of course, when we had colonized most of the eastern US, we had government-supported eradication campaigns designed to eliminate red wolves from areas where we had cattle and livestock. And so we had these federally supported eradication campaigns led by what would be considered now the USDA, but they were under a different program, 100 years ago when this stuff started. We also had uncontrolled or unregulated hunting. There was also habitat alteration. So a lot of the natural habitat that red wolves lived in were destroyed and replaced with agriculture or urban areas or whatnot. And of course, there was the eventual colonization of its historic range by the coyote, which it hybridizes with. But the main issue here was the direct killing of wolves by both the government and regular Joes across this historic range, which would have interfered with these two issues. It disrupted pack structure. It created solitary wolves wandering around in the landscape. And of course, that high mortality rate was too much for the wolf to recover from. They just didn't have the reproductive capacity to do that. And so as you had these solitary wolves moving around and this new species coming in and colonizing the area, it led to hybridization. So hybridization between red wolves and coyotes is not natural. It is mostly, if not completely, driven by human caused mortality, disrupting pack structure and social interactions between red wolves with other red wolves. So as I mentioned, this right here to your right on this map, the hatched area is the estimated historic range for the red wolf prior to European settlement of the US. And by 1960, this little area here in red on the coastal area of Louisiana and Texas wound up being the red wolf's last stronghold. We had probably about 100 animals down there around 1960, and that triggered the Fish and Wildlife Service to start investigating the area and start recovery efforts to see what they could do for the population. After about 10 or 20 years of research and actual efforts to get up red wolves for a captive breeding program, they realized that it was a lost cause down there, that too many wolves were being killed. On top of that, coyotes were moving in pretty quickly, and they were hybridizing. You had a hybrid swarm. So they managed to capture a few animals and start a captive breeding program. After about, I don't know, 10 years or so, they had about 90 animals in captivity, and they decided in 1987 to reintroduce some of those animals to northeastern North Carolina. And that's where we have the current population of animals that were released there 34 years ago this week in September. I think it was 4 pairs of red wolves, 8 total, that were cut loose out there. And that initiated the first reintroduction effort of wolves, I think, in the world. And this project wound up becoming, I think, the template for the Yellowstone project and the reintroductions for the Mexican gray wolf in the Southwest. So after the extirpation of red wolves, we had a new animal come into the eastern U.S., and that would be the coyote. And so what you're seeing here is a map that we put together for a publication looking at coyotes across their geographic range. And so after the red wolf was extirpated, they moved east into the eastern United States, but there was 3 historic range expansions for coyotes. If you look down here in Central America and southern Mexico, there's a blue hatched area. This area here is questionable. There might have been historically low populations or a low amount of coyotes in this area. The coyotes could have been there, but just at like low population sizes, or they might have been absent. But the point being is that when the Spanish colonized this area and they cleared it out and brought in cattle, by the 1700s, they started seeing coyotes pop up. And the assumption is either they created a landscape where coyotes became more abundant, or coyotes from central Mexico just moved down into this area. And so they've had coyote populations down in Central America for some time now. The second wave occurred in the late 19th century during the gold rush. And that's this green area up here in Northwest Canada and Alaska. So as we began to move into Alaska and these areas for, gold and whatnot, coyotes followed human development up into that area. And it wouldn't be until the 20th century here in this dark black hatched area in the eastern United States and parts of eastern Canada, southeastern Canada, that you start seeing coyotes move in. And that was a direct result of the extirpation of red wolves. Another big issue, another big factor for that was the deforestation and elimination of wetlands and the establishment of road networks. If you study coyotes, even wolves too, they love linear corridors, things like power lines, railroad tracks, dirt roads, stuff like that. They just get on them and they move on them. And so you can imagine during the 1930s, when you had these massive federally funded projects to develop agriculture in rural communities, and then to build road networks to get those agricultural goods to urban areas, they were draining wetlands and then they were putting roads in. And that was great for coyotes because those areas would have traditionally been tough for them to move through and set up shop and establish territories there. But in this case, it worked for them. And so they followed those road networks and all that stuff into the southeastern US and other parts of the US. And then, of course, if you're familiar with white-tailed deer and the history of white-tailed deer populations in the US, you know that white-tailed deer were almost extirpated themselves. And as we were restoring deer populations throughout the eastern US during 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, along with, establishing those roads, changing the landscape to accommodate agriculture. This was a prime situation where coyotes had food and better landscape. And at the same time, we're extirpating wolves, like red wolves, from the landscape to make room for cattle. And so we just sort of primed the landscape for coyote movement into the eastern US. So that's where they show up. And at this point, we have coyotes settled throughout the eastern US. And the issue we have with them is that they're a primary predator on ungulates like white-tailed deer. And so that's where the issue comes up now, is that we have some conflicts with coyote populations and managing deer numbers. And so there's been quite a bit of this written about and covered in the scientific literature. Looking at a paper from Bragna, I guess that's how you pronounce it, Bragnia, sorry guys. But it's a JWM paper looking at deer numbers throughout the eastern states of the US. And you can see these little lines in each state showing deer numbers over the past 20 years. And so I've got South Carolina boxed in because there's been other ongoing research there. So we have numbers there. And what you see here is in purple moving up is this exponential growth of coyote occurrence, or the number of coyotes killed by hunters and trappers. And so as the coyotes numbers increase, you're starting to see a decline in white-tailed deer numbers. And that's what a lot of these resource agencies are concerned about, because they derive a lot of funding from selling hunting licenses and working with hunters to keep some of their programs going and whatnot. And so it's always an issue of trying to figure out how to manage coyotes and their impacts on whether it's a wild turkey population or a white-tailed deer population. We're just dealing with their presence on people's properties and being concerned about issues of, coyotes messing with people's pets and whatnot. So at the local level, there's a number of ways you can develop cooperative agreements with landowners and to get on their property to manage. One way or another, they may advocate that they do habitat management that promotes, fauna recruitment and may discourage coyotes from coming on their properties and whatnot. The other way is just doing it at a regional level where they have certain policies from the agency's side where they just simply allow people, I guess, more opportunities to take coyotes. And they, maybe that will satisfy some issues with managing properties for deer. So as I mentioned, the approaches can be no action, direct manipulation on populations. That would be, hunting and trapping coyotes, or some indirect manipulation, whether it's managing habitat a certain way, or even in case of livestock, they can do non-lethal control of, or not non-lethal control, but like non-lethal means of preventing coyotes from having an effect on sheep or cattle or something like that. So coyotes exist on this rural to urban gradient. You can see from this diagram here, they go from these wild conditions to rural ex-urban to urban areas, say like downtown New York and Central Park or Atlanta or something like that. In rural areas out here, where you see these blue coyotes, usually the issues revolve around like depredation of livestock and wildlife. Lethal control is often the preferred method to deal with coyotes there, but we are improving on non-lethal approaches and to resolve some of those issues. But once you start getting into urban areas, the issue with coyotes starts to be, focused on depredation of pets and their contacts with humans. And suddenly, interactions with your state wildlife agencies tend to decrease, and people tend to have more contact with their local municipalities and HOAs with dealing with these animals. And then, of course, lethal control winds up being unpopular and a lot of times impractical in urban areas. So there's always this issue of managing coyotes, of trying to balance out these issues. And the reason why I bring this up, obviously, is because you'll see in a few slides, we deal with coyotes with managing red wolves. And so there's always this clash with trying to manage coyotes in the presence of wolves. So with the Wolf Conservation Center being sort of advocates for red wolf recovery, this is sort of the background in which or the environment in which the Wolf Center sort of operates in. So the mission statement at the Wolf Conservation Center is to protect and preserve wolves in North America through science-based education, advocacy, and participation in the federal recovery and release programs for, the two critically endangered wolf species, the Mexican gray wolf and the red wolf. Now that the past research at the Wolf Center has been sort of these small opportunistic projects that involve the captive wolves in the facility. Some of them have involved researchers approaching the Wolf Center for access to the captive wolves to do things like look at reproduction, to improve ex situ capabilities of managing red wolves in a captive setting. Some of these involve behavioral studies and education and outreach. But the future direction that we're trying to take now is to develop more of a large coordinated projects that are independent of captive wolves. In other words, to get out in the field and do research in the wild populations. One of the ways to do that is just to develop a research lab at the center. And that's where hiring me came about. And so one of the ways to do this is just to sort of find a balance between the conservation research that we can do on the ground and what the Wolf Conservation Center's mission statement is. And so to do that, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself, and then we'll get into the research and stuff. So I consider myself a wildlife biologist, and my background is predominantly ecology and management and the conservation of mammals. I've, for the past 15 years, have coordinated large-scale studies with academic institutions like at the University of Georgia, SUNY ESF up in Syracuse. I've worked with state and federal agencies, and I've worked with NGOs. Now, my research experiences range from studying like plant insect mutualisms. I've done a lot of work on vegetation studies and working with small mammals and other things, all the way up to studying hybridization between red wolves and coyotes. But like my meat and potatoes for the last decade and a half has been red wolves and coyotes. And so coming to the Wolf Conservation Center now, what research I'll bring to them is in this realm. And going forward, this is probably where we're going to spend most of our time doing research on. So my research usually is field intensive. It is me going out and trapping and getting my hands on animals, and usually using these mark recapture techniques. Usually my mark recapture is catching an animal and putting radio collars on them so that I can monitor them, look for space use, habitat selection, go in their territories, collect scat. I can look for diet. If they die, I can then look at what the cause of death is and measure survival. When we have animals in hand, I collect morphometrics, so we get measurements on animals' body sizes and their weights and stuff like that. And that's really important. And of course, there's also these GPS, GIS applications to look at, movement rates, areas that they spend most of their time in, and how they're used in the landscape to correlate landscape characteristics with wolf or coyote persistence. And those usually, as I mentioned, those are used to address questions about abundance, survival, mortality, diet, population trends, habitat selection. And then that information that can allow for certain scenario planning, risk assessment, and decision support that the agencies use when managing these populations. And these are usually, I think this area, and Maggie might correct me at the end, but this is usually the area that the Wolf Center is spending a lot of time in when they're doing their outreach and education and advocating for certain policies to be implemented that are useful for wolf recovery. And so me collecting this data, publishing on it, gives them a better ability to refine their ability to push for better risk assessment or decisions made by our agencies. Before we get on, just a little tangent here. This wolf up here in the right-hand corner, this is a female from like 2002. She was one of the two initial pups that were fostered into the recovery area in 2002, her and her brother. I was an intern there, and so that was the first time two animals were fostered into the wild population. Her brother survived and went on to be a breeder for the Beech Ridge Pack. She unfortunately passed away giving birth to pups, but she did manage to become the I guess you would call the alpha female for her pack after a few years of being there. It just happened that her first litter, there were some complications and she passed away giving birth. But yeah, these two, her and her brother, were the first two animals to be fostered into the wild. So I have four broad areas that I focus in on when I do research. So I'll just briefly cover those there. I'll cover them here. The first one is looking at factors that influence like the distribution and dynamics of like mammal populations. That's just simply trying to figure out like, hey, we got this population here. How big is the population? What's the extent of it? And then what are the important processes that are influencing good survival, strong reproduction? If the population is declining, what's causing survival to be on the downside, or what's preventing good reproduction? I like to address these questions at large spatial and temporal scales. So I don't like to do small size study sites or small scale studies. I tend to try to do very broad ecological studies, just because of my research interest. And a lot of times when it comes to managing large carnivores, you have to do them at large scales. These aren't animals that make a living on a wildlife management area. They use a lot of space. And then, of course, using this information to assess strategies that we use for management and recovery of canid populations, whether it's for the management of coyotes or for recovery of red wolves. The information is relevant there. And finally, I've been getting slowly pulled into this issue. It's not one by choice, but it just happens that sometimes research directions aren't always on purpose. But yeah, the taxonomy and evolution of canids in North America. I've been involved with this conversation about red wolves for a few years now, and it seems like I'm just going in that direction. So as I mentioned before about scale and doing research, and why size matters for me, it's because it's this scale is the spatial extent of an area that you're going to do research in, whether, so you're going to have to account for those logistics and capture animals and radio color them, but it doesn't always mean that you're getting at specific fine scale questions. So I'll just get through here. So to explain this little figure here I put up, I don't know if I always do a great job explaining this. So if you're looking at the extent here, this would be the size of your population down here. So fine scale would be like looking at a pack. Coarse would be looking at a population across a state. And then the grain here would be your research question. And so fine scale would be very specific. You're looking at something like, how much time does mom put into caring for her pups versus dad, as opposed to up here, just like, what is the reproductive output of the population? And so you're trying to balance your research question with the number of animals you're going to study. So if you really want to be concerned about how much male investment you have, say, you're concerned about how well, compared to, say, coyotes, you want to study male investment of red wolves compared to male investment in coyotes, you would be working down here, looking at maybe a handful of packs and spending your time paying attention to the entire pack structure. How many you have the two breeders, how many juveniles they have in the pack, and all that stuff there. But if you just worry about reproductive output, in that case, you're looking at, dozens and dozens of packs. You're just going in and counting puppies and then correlating that output with landscape characteristics and other things. And so your research questions can differ based on your ability to do research at different extents. It was what I'm getting at here, if that makes sense. So that's always the key balance that we have, or issues that we try to tackle. Getting at, I can't see this, I got this thing blocking I can't see the slide that well with Maggie, sorry. Anyway, so getting at the first research focus, looking at, temporal and spatial dynamics for research. As I mentioned before, I like to look at survival and reproduction. My past research has looked at like long-term data sets for red wolves and looked at call-specific mortality and survival rates for them, as well as looking at their mate selection in the wild, what we call size assortative mating between red wolves and coyotes. And what we found out there was that during the hunting season, survival drops quite a bit, but during the rest of the year, it's pretty high. And so correlating this issue of low survival during a time of year where we have hunting going on allows us to identify a key threat to red wolf persistence. And of course, to try to figure out how to mitigate that. But in the meantime, the wolves are dying, and a consequence of that is that the packs are breaking up and they're disbanding. And when you have that disbandment of packs, you don't have red wolves defending these areas, and that allows coyotes to move in and start encroaching, and they're interacting with other solitary wolves. many of the wolves don't pair up with coyotes, but a few of them wind up pairing up with them and setting up a new territory and breeding with them, which creates the issue of hybridization. And so we looked at this long-term data too to see what was influencing the choices that the wolves would make. Some wolves would kill coyotes and do a good job of displacing them until they could find another red wolf and set up a new territory with them. Other wolves didn't do that. And so looking at the proportion of pair bonding with what we call conspecifics, red wolves pairing up with red wolves, or congeneric, that would be a red wolf pairing up with a coyote, we found that most of the time the males did a really good job of pairing up with other red wolves, but a higher proportion of the females tended to pair up with coyotes and were responsible for some of the hybridization that we saw in the recovery area. And it wound up being an effective body size. The females tend to be below 60 pounds that were pairing up with coyotes. Most of the animals that were above 60 pounds just didn't pair up with coyotes, didn't try to consort with them. And so it makes sense that these animals can kind of size each other up. And when they're interacting with them, the body size differences often lead to differences in their diet and their space use. So a larger animal that's like 70, 75 pounds winds up having a larger territory and eating a lot of deer compared to an animal that's like 30 or 35 pounds. But when you have your large male coyotes that are around 40 pounds and they're interacting with a small female wolf that's around 50 pounds, they can sort of accommodate each other. That female wolf can maintain a small territory and live off rabbits and maybe some fawns. And so they make it work, and that was the issue. And so this past research we've done has been pretty vital in sort of illuminating those issues. So we have a wolf population. Hybridization is not normal, it's not natural. When you have high rates of human-caused mortality, particularly during the hunting season that corresponds with the red wolf's breeding season, you have that loss of individuals on the landscape. Coyotes move in. Not all the wolves pair bond with coyotes, just a small proportion of them do. The small proportion tends to be females because they're smaller and they're more, I don't want to say coyote-like, but because they're smaller, they can accommodate a coyote mate, and that's where you have the hybridization. So we have a clearer picture now of what's going on there. Moving forward, some of the current work I'm doing, this one's kind of out in left field, but it's just a project going on. It's looking at the distribution of population size of moose and Adirondack Park up in New York. Questions for that can be at the end. But what's really important here is that we have this large scale project in the Southeast looking at coyotes and looking at call-specific mortality and survival for them. And we'll cover this a little bit more in a couple slides. That's important because in the future, we're going to obviously want to establish new red wolf populations elsewhere. We're going to need a surrogate species to assess the conditions on the ground that those wolves may be going into. And so we can look at red wolf or coyote survival across the Southeast and sort of figure out, what is the main mortality factor for canids. And if mortality is human-caused mortality is low, those might be good areas for red wolf recovery. The second one is obviously looking at the second area of research is looking at like these ecological processes that operate at these broad spatial and temporal scales. So as I mentioned, most of my study areas tend to be big. They're usually, greater than 1,500 square kilometers. And what I'm trying to do is establish a study site that captures dispersal. What I'm trying to get at here is basically, I want a study area big enough that the animals that I come in contact with and mark and study are born in my study site, they disperse in my study site, they find a mate, settle down with that mate, have offspring, and then eventually sort of die in my study area. I want a study area that's large enough to capture all these important processes, because these processes affect, population persistence, which when you're working with an endangered species, it's important to understand which processes are functioning and which ones are not, so that you can gear your management towards mitigating things that are causing some issues. As I mentioned, you want to understand these processes to do that. And to do that, you have to have multiple sites across the landscape. So for now, I've had study sites in North Carolina. I've had 2 in South Carolina, 2 in Georgia, 2 in Alabama. We're now in Louisiana and Texas, so we have quite a bit. And so we're slowly building up a lot of space to do this research. So some of the stuff that came out of this past research, looking at these broad movements and whatnot in the landscape with wolves and coyotes is in North Carolina, the recovery area is quite large. It's about 6,000 square kilometers, which is like 3/4 the size of Yellowstone. And so when you radio mark coyotes, we actually, were able to monitor them. We didn't lose them. Most of them stayed in the recovery area. And that allowed us to study transiency in coyotes, which is really important because that's how coyotes persist on the landscape under excessive human control or killing or whatever. Basically, you'll have coyote packs on the landscape, and a number of them are experiencing high mortality from hunting or trapping or whatever. Other packs aren't. And so those packs are basically sending out dispersers, which we call transients. And those animals wind up filling in those vacancies that are created by hunters. And so a population may get shot up pretty bad. There's some turnover, but then it sort of reorients itself. It recombinates or whatever. Those transients plug those vacancies, and then they just sort of start breeding again. And that's what's happening out there. And we were able to see that in North Carolina. And so we were able to link that to coyote persistence, and then of course their encroachment to red wolf territories and issues with hybridization. We also looked at the morphometrics and genetic variation of coyotes across North America. And we were able to propose a new hypothesis about the benefit of being large in eastern coyotes compared to the western populations. We've always thought that bigger coyotes in the east meant that they ate more ungulates than their western counterparts, but that's not true. Western coyotes are predators of ungulates out there. White-tailed deer are a western species. They hit those things quite hard. Mule deer, pronghorns. They've been documented killing elk calves, stuff like that. So, and these are animals that are much smaller. So you have to ask yourself the question, like, okay, if coyotes were colonizing the eastern U.S. at a time when white-tailed deer were at their lowest population levels, nearly extirpated, there weren't many of them to hunt anyway, but yet the body size is increasing. Why would that happen? And through some genetic, some genomic work and stuff like that, we were able to deduce from some circumstantial evidence that it's probably linked to dispersal capabilities. Bigger animals can move further and they can move faster. And so if you're in an environment where there's not many other coyotes, this is the initial stages of colonization, you're going to be by yourself for a long time before you find another coyote. So it's probably good that you can spend a lot of time not eating. And so their ability to not starve to death or anything like that, if they had litters, the litters didn't require as much feeding, just the body size would have benefited their dispersal capabilities to find other populations. And so we feel like that might have been, the big benefit there. And so we proposed that. And I think that's some of that's coming to fruition with, or we're gaining more support for that hypothesis of some other research. We also were able to demonstrate genetically and morphologically that there's 3 distinct populations of coyotes in North America: the Western population, the Northeastern, and the Southeastern. It's not new news or anything like that. That's kind of what we suspected. But what was nice was that we found the contact zone between the Northeastern and the Southeastern population. It looks like the Northeastern population of coyotes extends south into Virginia towards the North Carolina border. And that North Carolina, Virginia border seems to be the contact zone between those two Southeastern, the Southeastern and Northeastern populations. And so, as I mentioned, so we have this current research we're moving forward with now is to maintain these sites and the data from these sites, and to continue these large scale assessments of coyote populations throughout the red wolf's historic range. We have a project right now. We're actually assessing melanism in Canis taxa throughout the Southeast. When you look at the red wolves, and Amy will cover this, I believe, next week when she gives her talk. Black individuals were common in red wolf populations. Goldman tried to scientifically name the red wolf Canis niger, but because of some technicalities, it went back to Canis rufus. But because Black animals are so prevalent in the red wolf population, they wanted to call it the black dog or something like that. But the Black phenotype is extinct in current extent red wolf populations. We don't have Black wolves anymore, but we do have Black hybrids and we do have Black coyotes. And so we were looking at melanism in these populations, and we found that it's not really prevalent in coyotes. Maybe about 10% of a coyote population and a hybrid population consist of Black individuals. But what was unique was that we found that space use between gray and Black animals differed. So Black animals had much larger territory sizes than their gray counterparts did, and they preferred closed canopy areas and wetlands compared to gray animals, which preferred open habitats and more agricultural. So the two main phenotypic characteristics of eastern coyote populations that are very wolf-like are the body size, the increase in body mass, and other body measurements, as well as the Black phenotype. And both of those characteristics usually increases their use of space and different types of habitat, not consumption of deer. And so again, like I said, as we're developing, new data and whatnot, we're seeing that this hypothesis that the red wolf traits that coyotes acquire in the eastern US seem to be more correlated with space use and movement and dispersal than it does with their ability to kill deer and eat deer. So the fourth area, obviously, is looking now at developing strategies for recovery and management. That's it's for red wolves. This is a tough area because we don't know much about their population because we extirpated it before we had any real good scientific data on it. And then we're reintroducing the animal to a human dominant landscape that re-exposes them to factors that were responsible for their extirpation. The issue with human cause mortality is not gone. We're still dealing with it. And so we have, as I mentioned before, looked at these sort of site-specific approaches to assess red wolf and coyote ecology, looking at space use, diet, their interactions and survival. We've been publishing papers on the conservation and management of red wolves, calling for different strategies to be used that we think will enhance recovery. So right now, some of my current work, like today, I spent most of today on the red wolf recovery team, going over the potential, the helping develop the new recovery plan for the future of recovery efforts for the species. And then, of course, we're in the process of assessing coyote management practices in the recovery area. We have a manuscript and prep ready to go back out that assesses the use of non-lethal and lethal means of managing coyotes to prevent introgression in red wolves, as well as possibly looking at the side effects of that on coyote numbers and abundance in an area. And then we're going to be looking at throughout the historic range and assessing those areas for potential reintroduction sites. And finally, like I mentioned before, this area of looking at taxonomy and systematics with canids, it's not an area that I intended to get into. I sort of kind of found myself in it just because the red wolf has always been a species where people have argued about its origins. And so, working on these animals, you just sort of get pulled into it. Just recently, we've published data on their morphometrics. So we've looked at red wolves and coyotes in northeastern North Carolina and compared their body measurements. And what we found was that, red wolves have this unique phenotype of a large canid that's usually over 50, 55 pounds. The males can be up to 85 pounds, but are usually high 60s, low 70s. Females tend to be around the 60-pound mark. These phenotypic traits aren't acquired by or achieved by coyotes. We just don't have big coyotes like that. Your biggest coyotes are going to be, low to mid 40s. Your hybrids, the same thing. You're not finding many hybrids that are over 50 pounds. Most of them tend to be in their low 40s. And so the red wolf just has this unique phenotype that's just not achieved by anything else. And so that information is relevant for looking at its taxonomy and trying to deduce its origin and whatnot and its uniqueness. We've also looked at behaviors that might be facilitating reproductive isolation between red wolves and coyotes. That goes back to the size of sort of mating. That's important because for species to be for populations to be considered different species, they have to be reproductively isolated, meaning that they don't just freely interbreed with each other. Now, the red wolf and the coyote can interbreed, but the fact that there is some isolating mechanisms there indicates that they are on their own unique, evolutionary trajectory, if that makes sense. They're not completely isolated yet. They're both relatively young species from my understanding. And so there isn't complete separation reproductively yet, but the mechanisms there help get at that question as to whether or not they are distinct enough to be classified as different species. And then recently I helped assist with the National Academy of Sciences assessment of red wolf taxonomy. I was invited twice to give a talk about my research and whatnot. The assessment came back and concluded that the red wolf was indeed a unique species, warrant of protection. And so they concluded that its origin was not a result of recent hybridization between coyotes and gray wolves, that this was a endemic wolf species to the eastern US, and it's closely related to coyotes and has a unique evolutionary history that's independent of gray wolves, which is a big win for red wolves. And so right now, that same panel recommended the Fish and Wildlife Service to fund a study to rediscover red wolf ancestry in canid populations along Louisiana's coastal areas. And so I'm currently a PI on that project, where we're down there assessing the population to find any potential ancestry in those coyotes. So here's the two projects that we have going on. The Tri-State project I'm going to talk about now, the field work is done with that. I just have a massive set of data from there. So I'm going to summarize that really quickly. So this project was a large-scale project funded by Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and South Carolina's Department of Natural Resources. My primary collaborators here is my old advisor, Mike Chamberlain at UGA, and then I'm, Bridget Von Holt at Princeton University. She's a geneticist there. She handles a lot of the she basically does most of all of her genetic work, collaboration, stuff like that. And so the purpose of this study was to assess coyote space use across the landscape, go out to a broad geographic area and capture as many coyotes as we could to radio collar. So we deployed 165 GPS collars on 165 coyotes, 55 per state, to get at space use and dispersal and whatnot. So we're looking at, like I said, where these animals are setting up territories. And then we're looking at how they're selecting habitat in those territories. We're also looking at transient movements and how transients are selecting areas to establish territories. Then we're going into those areas and we're assessing diet and, of course, survival. So you can see here, this is a dead coyote that was shot. And so we recover the carcass, and then we know the location of the carcass, and then we can measure the animals, the carcass location of certain landscape characteristics to assess what landscape what characteristics on the landscape increase the likelihood that a coyote is going to die of a gunshot mortality, being hit by a car or something like that. This is important because if we're going to, use this research to promote red wolf recovery, as I mentioned earlier, coyotes are going to be a surrogate species. They currently occupy the entire historic range of the red wolf, and we only have one red wolf population. So if we're looking at other areas, those coyote populations are currently experiencing conditions on the ground that we would expect red wolves to encounter too. The other thing too is coyotes are pretty resilient to management practices or regimes or whatever. And so when we want to know why coyotes are doing so well, we can get at that. And then we can then expect, and compare that to the red wolves and then try to figure out what we need to do to promote recovery for red wolves in those areas. So I mentioned before, in northeastern North Carolina, red wolf mortality by month drops quite a bit in the fall and winter because of the deer hunting season. There's also a small drop in survival during May and June because that's the spring gobbler season. That's when we have turkey hunters out there. You see a similar trend with coyotes throughout the Southeast. Again, you see that little dip in May and June, and then you see a decline here in November and December. We just have a small sample size here compared to the red wolves here, but it's a similar trend. So we know that coyotes outside the recovery area are experiencing similar mortality rates as red wolves are in the recovery area. So we should expect that as you put red wolves elsewhere, nothing's changing. The red wolves are still going to get shot up during the fall and winter hunting seasons. And so that's an issue that would have to be taken care of, obviously, at a reintroduction site. But at least we can use the red wolves to confirm some of our fears as to what might cause a reintroduction to fail. The other project, as I mentioned, is this this project that was awarded by the Fish and Wildlife Service to reassess these coastal areas in Louisiana for red wolf ancestry. This one's led by Dr. Kristen Brensky at Michigan Tech, and then under her are myself and Dr. Bridget Von Holt, who are on the ground out, or I'm on the ground out there, capturing these animals and working with them to do the genomic stuff. This is in progress, but ultimately the effort here is to understand taxonomy of canids in the southeastern U.S. So I was down in Louisiana from late January until I think late May, trapping canids in southwest coastal areas down there in Louisiana. And so capture them, radio collar them, take blood, send the blood off to Bridget to do the assessment on their ancestry. And then of course we get the morphometrics, we get the space use. As they die in the field, we get cause specific mortality and survival rates, all this stuff. And so what we want to do ultimately is combine all of our data sets and then look at all the canids that we have from Texas, Louisiana, all the way up to North Carolina, and assess the impact that red wolf ancestry has on these canids' morphology and on their ecology in terms of, what they're doing in the field, in the woods, and how that affects their niche. And this will again help with clarifying the red wolf's ecological role and strengthening the evidence that it is its own unique species, warranted of protection and whatnot. And then finally, the project that I'll be getting going at the Wolf Center, that is a wolf-centered led project, is identifying future introduction sites for red wolves in the eastern United States. My primary collaborators are Jeremy Bruscotter from Ohio State University, and then Dr. Michael Chamberlain at University of Georgia, and John Vucetich at Michigan Tech. John and Jeremy come together as a team, and then Mike and I come together as a team just because of our past working relationships. But ultimately, our primary goal is to coalesce this ecological data that we have on canids throughout the Southeast. Then we want to look at this social data on social tolerance, and that's where Jeremy and John come in. To look, I'll get at that in a minute. And then of course, what I mean by management data is agency data on how they manage white-tailed deer populations, wild pigs, hunting regulations, stuff like that. And the reason we want to do that is because we can establish a hierarchical process using modeling to evaluate site suitability for reintroductions. The first thing we want to do is to model out suitable habitat across the historic range, define areas that would be suitable for red wolves, meaning that in those areas, the red wolves have enough habitat, food, whatever to persist. And then the next step is not isolating, but identifying which areas are, politically feasible to release wolves in. And that's where the social tolerance data comes in. We can assess at county levels people's openness for carnivores and carnivore reintroduction. So we may identify, say, 20 sites that might be useful for releasing red wolves. But out of those 20 sites, we can then pick 5 or 10 that are the best for an environment that might be open and tolerant for red wolves. So then once you have that, then of course you have to look at the site-specific stuff. And that's where you look for triggers for conflict. That's where the management data will come in and play an important role, because once we put those wolves on the ground out there, they will wind up dying from something. And knowing what they're going to die of is what's going to trigger mitigation efforts from the Fish and Wildlife Service. If it's road mortality, then that's an easy fight, because then you can put up road signs, maybe get an underpass, stuff like that to lower road mortality. But if it's something that's tied to hunting and hunting management, then you're going to have a fight that like you're having in North Carolina. And that's usually going to resolve around coyotes and how people want to manage coyotes. And so knowing specifically before you go in what could trigger for conflict would be useful for conflict resolution. And so I think that's what's unique here, because then if we can do that, then we have a roadmap for red wolf recovery. We can provide the Fish and Wildlife Service important information on, like, here's all the suitable habitat, here's the human dimension stuff that would allow a recovery to happen. And then once you have wolves in the ground, these are the things that are going to affect survival. These are the things that might trigger something to happen on the ground there where some of the locals may put up some serious political opposition to recovery efforts. And so that would be useful, because you're not doing recovery blindly. You can anticipate these things. And finally, that can then be expanded to other large carnivore projects to create a like a blueprint or something like that. And so, again, Red Wolf recovery could be beneficial for other recovery efforts in this way, as it was for the Yellowstone project and the project in the Southwest for Mexican grays. And so with that going forward, with this attempt to develop a research lab at the center, how does that look going forward? Well, the research focus is going to be a balance between, my interest in what I can do as a researcher in terms of my skill set. I'm not a geneticist, so you're not going to have genetic research being done at the Wolf Center. That's going to be sort of farmed out to Bridget and Kristen. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of finding a balance between what the Wolf Conservation Center needs, their mission statement for advocacy and education, and what I can do for them as a researcher. There's always chasing funding, so we'll pursue research funds from different agencies. Of course, that means if we're getting money from those agencies, it's coming with a certain, strings attached to it. So there's going to be deliverables in that aspect. And sometimes it's going to require research in other wildlife species. So the tri-state project that we had in those 3 states in the Southeast, the resource agencies didn't give us the money to study coyotes per se. It was given to us to study coyotes in relation to deer and the impacts that coyotes may have on deer populations. So if we want to address some research on whatever, we may have to come in at a different angle to accommodate, to get funding to accommodate our needs there. Of course, then there's also building research collaborations and affiliations with other universities and other researchers. And this just gives us access to other existing projects and data that's out there. Just data sharing, just doing things. You go to a conference, you meet your fellow collaborators there, and you work out projects, divide things up. And that's where you come in. So I may not have to go out and do research on a specific species in the field. I could just know somebody and we work things out, and they provide me data, and then I give them some logistical support somehow, whether it's through analyses or something like that. And again, like I mentioned, collaboration on large projects. And then finally, these collaborations and affiliations give us the ability to acquire other resources that aren't necessarily in terms of money. So this would be access to a university's library, GIS equipment, or even access to grad students serving on committees and whatnot. So there's a lot of room for growth here at the Wolf Center with this position now and where we're going. So this is where I end and take questions. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Joey. So we'll go ahead and answer some questions now. But for those of you who joined a little bit late, we're here with Joey Hinton, who just finished his presentation with a really thorough overview of past and present research about red wolves and some of the implications moving forward in terms of their recovery. So if you do have questions, just enter them in the Q&A box on your control panel. We're really not monitoring the chat, so if you have something in chat that you want us to see, please just stick it in that Q&A box. All right, so we have lots of questions, Joey, and there are definitely some themes. I guess we'll start with, there are a lot of questions about red wolf coyote pups. So these hybrid pups. And I'll just kind of look at a few of these questions and put them together. Someone wants to know if they have a higher survival rate and better health metrics than purebred red wolves. And another question that's very related, it's just what do they look like if you have a picture? And do they join the wolf packs or coyote packs? And the last question I saw on the topic was, do first generation hybrid coyote red wolf offspring tend to pair with wolves or coyotes in further generations? I know you touched upon the size differences, but there's 3 just to start with. So. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to remember those 3 the best I can as I answer this. So if I just remind me if I miss one, Maggie. So I'm going to start backwards, I guess. The F1s are very coyote-like. They're not big. So when a red wolf pairs with a coyote and produces that first generation of what we call an F1 hybrid, this is a 50-50 animal. They're usually, like 45 pounds or so. Very rarely are they huge. They're awkwardly looking coyotes. You may have an animal that is the same sort of what I call linear measurements. The height and body length is similar to a coyote, but it has a big blocky head or big feet, or it has a small head and it's really tall. And they just have a bit of a weird look to them, but they're not as big as a wolf is. The way what we call, the F2s are the same way. The only way that a non-wolf, like a highly introgressed coyote, would approach a red wolf body size would be if it back crossed several generations into the red wolf population, meaning that it increased in ancestry. It went from 50% to 75% to like 85 to 92%. But at that point, it's becoming more wolf-like as it's acquiring more wolf genetics, if that makes sense. So the hybrids aren't, in my opinion, they're not very similar to red wolves. They just have certain characteristics that say, hey, that's kind of wolfish, like the big blocky head. The next one, I guess, was about do coyotes, do hybrids join wolf packs? No. So what happens here? You'll have the way a pack starts is that you'll have two animals meet up on the landscape, and they will consort with each other for several weeks. Sometimes it happens quick, other times it doesn't. But on average, it takes several weeks of them moving around and just working together as a couple. And if it works out, they just stay together. And when they do that, they'll have their first litter. That litter then, that's going into year 2. Some of those animals will hang around, 1 or 2 may disperse. And then they go into the 3rd year, and then they have that other litter. And then that's how you get your multi-generational pack, where you have, the adult breeders, and then you have a couple generations of offspring. In those situations, it's very hard for a coyote or a hybrid to infiltrate the pack. So if, say, the male breeder was shot and you have mom there and she has a couple juveniles and 4 pups, a coyote can try to come in and encroach and check her out and see if she's receptive to him. But to do that, he also has to accommodate the juveniles in that pack, plus the pups, who are all much bigger than he is. And overwhelmingly, it just doesn't happen. The way the pair bonding happens between a wolf and a coyote, or a wolf and a hybrid, is in that first year, where the mate is shot shortly after they have bred or they've pair bonded, and you have that one solitary animal. Then that coyote can come in, and if they consort and they can accommodate each other, then you have the breeding that happens, and then the hybrids are born. And of course, like I said, the hybrids are very coyote-like. So you'll have one big animal and one coyote, and you'll have these sort of, I don't want to say intermediate, but they are larger than mom in this case, if it's mom's the coyote, but much smaller than dad individuals. You have that mixed pack there. And then what was the first one, Maggie? The first question?
If purebred red wolves would somehow have, I guess, be less healthy than the hybrids. Is there any benefit?
Yeah, so that depends what you mean. Genetic health wise, I would have to say maybe no, because the red wolf population is highly inbred now because there's so few of them. But in terms of survival, the answer is, in my opinion, no. We're working on this data right now, looking at coyote survival, red wolf survival, and hybrid survival. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is a major mortality source on the coyote hybrid population out there. And the hybrids aren't responding any differently to the Fish and Wildlife Service's management than coyotes are. So I don't see any difference between coyote and hybrid survival in the recovery area, indicating that I don't think there's any special like adaptability or a new niche for hybrids there. In terms of the red wolf, yeah, I mean, red wolves just do not do well on anthropogenic landscapes because they're larger body size. In that case, hybrids probably in an uncontrolled environment probably would have higher survival and would be more adapted to a human dominant landscape. But in an area where we're trying to recover the animals, no, I mean, I think under management, the wolves do really well. and the hybrids they're doing as well as the coyotes are. And so I don't think there's anything really special about the hybrids. They're just coyotes with some wolf genetics in them. And so I don't know if that satisfies the question or not, but
Well, it's a good try.
it's tough. It's complex.
Exactly.
We're working that out with the research.
And I see some more themes. So I'll just quickly touch on this. A lot of people would like to know more about how you got your start. Some people are currently in school and would like to know about your degree. And some people are actually really interested in working with red wolves specifically, and currently in school.
Yeah, so I got my start. It was just luck. I had finished my undergrad in 2002, and I had applied for an internship with the recovery program, and they initially turned me down. They had two field techs, two interns doing the telemetry work, and they were actually looking for a caretaker. So I was kind of glad they turned me down, because I'm not a big fan of caretaking. It's really labor intensive work, and it's just not in my interest. And then I got a call back from Chris Lukash, saying like, look, his intern was kind of quitting abruptly on him because she got into a master's program in Michigan, and he needed somebody on the fly. And he wanted to know if I was available. And the only really reason why he was hiring me is because I was the only one out of the applicant pool that had telemetry experience. And I had done small mammal telemetry in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia and West Virginia. And so that's why he hired me. And then I got out there, and it was a lot of just like work. I was just a really good intern for them, and it wound up developing into friendships, stuff like that. So your average intern out there did like 3 months. I wound up doing like 10, 12 months out there because I didn't want to leave. I just really enjoyed it. And because I was a reliable, good worker, they just kept me out there. They just figured, why lose this guy? Just use him as long as we can. And he's just going to go on at some point. And then I left to go do a master's project on, actually I started my PhD initially on studying Sonita moth and Sonita cacti mutualism interactions in the Sonoran Desert of like Southern Arizona and Mexico. And when you get into grad school, what you realize is sometimes you don't hit it off well with your advisor. And at some point you just may have to go find a new lab. And that's what happened. And so I contacted Chris and told him that things weren't working out with me and my advisor at that point. He said, well, just come out here and we'll figure something out. And so I wound up dropping my dissertation to a master's project and went back out to North Carolina. And when I got out to North Carolina, they were discussing issues with hybridization and needing someone to address those conditions or that question. And so I wound up working with him and Ford Money at the time with developing these research questions and what they could do to help me get collars and get a truck and housing and all that stuff. And so then I wound up applying for other programs. And it's tough to get into a lot of these programs. I wound up finding an advisor, Mike Chamberlain, who was really interested in this stuff. And he wound up taking me on. And that's just how it worked. There was a lot of luck. It's a tough thing to say. It's a lot of it's just timing and knowing people and just having the opportunity pop up. I don't think anything special. Like I think anybody could have done what I did. It was just luck and timing. So future research now with the red wolf population is going to be tough. When I went out there to do my research, we had a stable population of 150 animals. There's like 10 out there now, and things aren't looking good for the wild population. I mean, there is room for research. I think future research for red wolves is going to focus on the area that I'm slowly moving into, which is identifying future reintroduction sites and then addressing some of the human dimension side of things, particularly that social tolerance arena or whatever you want to call it. Just and that seems to be the area now, because we just don't have a wild population anymore. Until they get that wild population restored and recovered to 100 or so animals, the kind of research that I did out there 10 years ago, you're just not going to be able to do. It's just not there to do that research. So that's the area where I guess future research is going to happen in the next 5-10 years.
Well, I think you could say also it takes some hustle, right? It's
Yeah.
hard work. So you just mentioned actually these looking for reintroduction sites, and there are a lot of questions about that. And some people offer, specific areas like national parks, the Shenandoah, Great
Yeah.
Smoky Mountains, Everglades. Another question touches on why the red wolf recovery sites seem to be along coastal areas more than inland areas. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's just that. There's been two sites. One was in the Smokies. It didn't work out, and one is in coastal North Carolina. If there's some confusion about what's happening down in Louisiana, Texas, that was not a recovery site. That area was the last remnant wolves left in the landscape before we pulled them off and put them in a captive breeding program. So the last stronghold for red wolves was the Mississippi River Basin and coastal Louisiana and Texas. And of course, as the numbers dwindled there, like I said, they pulled them out. And then the first site that they reintroduced them at was in eastern North Carolina. At the time, the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge was acquired through, I think it was Prudential Insurance, or some corporation donated a ton of like swampy land to the Fish and Wildlife Service to start a refuge there. And when they got that, there was low human density, there was no cattle, no livestock, and there weren't any coyotes, and it just seemed like a good area to put the wolves at. So they had some good support from the locals, and that's what they did, and that's where that site started up. I think in 1994 they tried the Smokies, and they went in there and they cut a breeding pair loose in Cades Cove. That first year the pair did well, survived, and they just went ahead and started trying to introduce other animals there. But the issue was that in the Smokies, for whatever reason, it just seemed like prey availability wasn't there on the Park Service land, and so it required the wolves to leave Park Service property to go onto adjacent lands and other areas where you had livestock, and there were some depredation issues, and it just wasn't feasible. They hadn't worked out the co-op agreements with the local, property owners or the state and federal agencies that weren't, the Park Service. And after about 6-7 years, they just wound up closing shop. They had issues with parvo. They weren't producing pups. There's a number of issues why that project didn't work out. I think if they went back in and tried it again, they could probably be more successful, but at the time that just didn't work out. So in my opinion, though, like I get the question about the coastal areas. When I look at the historic range, my eyes always go to coastal areas just because that's where I'm used to working in with the North Carolina population, and now that the Texas, Louisiana one. And that's mostly because most of your agriculture is along those coastal areas, and agricultural fields have high deer densities and lots of prey. It's open habitat. Red wolves love open grassland areas. And so wheat fields, cornfields, stuff like that are like a surrogate for that sort of open grassy area that they can chase down prey and stuff like that. And I think they just do really well. The downside is, of course, those areas are heavily hunted too. And because they're in open environments, they can be seen, so they get shot too. And it's I guess it's a double-edged sword for recovery efforts. But agriculture is actually pretty good for red wolves. End the question. Yeah, so that's it. So,
And here's another one. There's a few questions related to like the ghost alleles or genes from the canids along the Gulf Coast, and if there are any plans of introducing them into the red wolf population by selective breeding or otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a bit controversial. It depends. I mean, I guess it depends. I mean, I think it differs even with me and my colleagues when we discuss that. I don't see that happening. So down there trapping, we're not encountering anything that's red wolfish. Like the coyotes there that we're capturing are phenotypically speaking different from the surrounding coyote populations, and that they have like wolf-like characteristics, but they aren't red wolves. They're just highly introgressed coyotes. In terms of getting that unique ancestry that's absent from the current population in North Carolina and the captive one, how you get that into that, I don't know. If there's technology that you could extract a gene complex from an animal or something like that. Maybe that happens, but the idea is that, maybe at some point we catch an animal that's like 90% red wolf, 10% coyote down there. And, what do you do with that animal? Can you put it in the captive stock and then back cross it out? That could be a possibility. I don't know. I think we're going towards that direction of having that conversation. It's kind of a vague way of answering that. Right now, I'd say there's not much of a possibility to do that. From my perspective with Louisiana and looking at red wolf ancestry down there, I think it's important it's essentially to me necropsying the region and finding those areas where you have high ancestry that tells us that those were the last areas where we had red wolves. And it's definitely a situation where we didn't get all the red wolves up. So you might have had some unknown presence of red wolves going into the early 80s, maybe even to the early 90s, who knows? And eventually they just were assimilated into the coyote population. So the ancestry in the coyotes down there will highlight those areas. And then we can correlate certain landscape characteristics with that red wolf ancestry to ask, to answer the question is, why is it persistent? What's facilitating that persistence? And if we can get at those answers, then that information can be used for recovery efforts. We can identify, like I said, those important characteristics on the landscape that could help identify areas that are suitable for red wolves, and then go from there. But in terms of moving genetic material from that population and along the Gulf Coast into the captive or the wild population in North Carolina, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But maybe down the road, the technology might be there to do it. So we'll see.
Awesome. And I know that you can speak to this. We've discussed it quite a bit. Someone's asking has there been a study of the interaction of coyotes and red wolves with respect to which would dominate? Can both survive together, or will red wolf recovery only work in areas without coyotes?
So the answers are a couple yeses and a couple nos. So coyotes don't dominate. Red wolves win out all the time. We've looked, looking at long-term data in the recovery area, it looks like about 10 or 12% of all the radio-marked coyotes that we used as placeholders were killed by red wolves. And that's on par with some of the mortality data on gray wolf coyote interactions out west. That those can range anywhere from like 7% to I think like 17% or something like that. The red wolves fall right in there too. So they're just as effective at killing coyotes as gray wolves are. And they don't lose space to coyotes. We don't see coyotes or even hybrids displacing red wolves. It's always the other way around. And so our field research that we've done indicates that there isn't any way that red wolves can coexist with coyotes. If you have a strong core population of red wolves, say several hundred, you're going to have very few coyotes out there. If you have lots of coyotes, it's because you don't have a strong red wolf population. And so as we acquire more wolves in the landscape, they're just going to push coyotes out. The interactions between a red wolf and a coyote is much different than what you see out west between gray wolves and coyotes. What you see at Yellowstone, where, gray wolves will pull down an elk and they'll sit on an elk carcass for, I don't know, a week or whatever. And you see film of them chasing off coyotes. And every now and then you'll see the coyotes come back. Eventually one coyote's caught by the pack and killed. That doesn't happen in North Carolina. It doesn't happen in the Southeast. Red wolves and coyotes don't overlap in territories. So as you see with this wolf here, you can see that carcass. That's a deer rib cage there in front of that wolf there. The white-tailed deer are small. They're not big ungulates. So both red wolves and coyote packs quickly consume carcasses. And because their territories don't overlap, you don't have coyotes crossing into a red wolf territory and scavenging on carcasses and then leaving. The reason being is because gray wolves and coyotes are reproductively isolated. They can tolerate having a coyote in their territory. Red wolves can't do that because if that wolf is not paying attention, that coyote could breed its mate. It could breed one of the offspring that's there. So they just can't tolerate coyotes in those territories. And so they displace them. And so, like I said, they always went out. If we have a strong core population of red wolves in an area, you're going to see a big decline in coyote numbers. And what was the other one? The other part of the question too, Maggie? Sorry, losing my train of thought because I'm rambling.
I actually don't remember. I think you covered most of it.
Okay.
If red
It was
wolves could
coyote.
recover without, with.
So coyotes are probably a good indicator for areas that would be great for red wolves. As much as that's like nails on a chalkboard for some people, if you have an area that's saturated with coyotes, that means it's good habitat and there's lots of prey there. You're going to want to put red wolves there, and if you get, like I said, if you get a good core population of red wolves, they'll sort that out, push the coyotes out. The reason being, like I mentioned before, with the mating, if a red wolf needs to pair bond with a coyote, it will establish a territory with that coyote, and they move together. They're always seen together, meaning that they're using the same habitat and they're eating the same thing. So, so if you have coyotes in an area, clearly that's an area that red wolves can use. And if there aren't any coyotes there, that's just terrible habitat. And if coyotes can't even make it there, then there's no way a red wolf's going to make it there. So coyote densities are going to be good indicators for good habitat for red wolves. And you're just going to have to go into those areas and just managing them and sort it out over time.
Okay, I think we'll end on this question. It's a good question. And it is, how many red wolves can the North Carolina recovery area support? And how many similar areas would be necessary for the species to recover?
So right now, the current species survival plan, or the SSP, I think calls for 3 reintroduction sites. Our assumption is probably more, obviously, as many as we can get. But in North Carolina, we maxed out at 151 red wolves and I think like 25 packs. I feel like the recovery area can probably hold about 220, 225. I wouldn't be shocked if you can get more in there. We just never got that. We just couldn't. It's just, stuff happened in 2014 and things regressed, unfortunately. It depends on the size of a reintroduction site. Like I said, the recovery area is 6,000 square kilometers. The recovery area in North Carolina, of that 6,000 square kilometers, red wolves probably can use about 70% of it. And then from there, the average red wolf territory size is probably, I think, about 70 to 75 square kilometers. So you got to divide that up with reproductive packs. What's the average pack size? And of course, you're going to have dispersers and transients floating around. And so, that's how you're going to figure out how many animals a recovery site could support, is the extent, the size of it, how much of that area can actually be used by wolves, and then their average space requirements, and then the average size of a pack and stuff like that. So in North Carolina, we need at least 6,000 square kilometers to support, say 220. The other reintroduction sites are going to have to be similar sizes to support similar numbers. So several Yellowstones across the Southeast to get these animals going.
Several Yellowstones. Wow. Okay. Well, we didn't get to all the questions, but we did get to a lot of them. And Joey, I really want to thank you for your time. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap things up?
No, right now I'm just kind of excited to get things going with the Wolf Center. So I'm glad to be where I'm at, and just stay in touch. I guess if you got questions, you guys know where to get me or contact me, the Wolf Center. So I appreciate the opportunity to chat. And next week when we get Amy on here, Amy Schutt is a I always call her a photojournalist, or she's not. She's actually like a multimedia photographer, and she's like a storyteller. So she was on the ground with us in Louisiana when we got the Gulf Coast project going, and she was documenting our trapping efforts and handling animals and releasing them and the whole story. And she just knows a ton of history about red wolves in Louisiana, Texas. And her talk next week is going to cover all that, plus the history of red wolves in that region. So all the great vintage, like black and white photos, and like the story of locals and how they interacted with red wolves up until, our research out there a few months ago, she's going to cover. We have a podcast coming out. She's going to cover that podcast and all the other cool stuff. So if you want to learn more about all this stuff, Maggie, you got the date and time, I think. I don't know, but it'll get posted at some point.
Yep. Actually, it's next Thursday, the 23rd. It'll be at 6 o'clock, and Joey will be joining us as well.
Yep.
And if you would like more information or to register, you can just go to our website, which is www.nywolf.org. And that's also where you can just learn more about our work, our scientific webinar series, what Joey's up to, or the 36 wolves who currently call the Wolf Center home. So again, we really appreciate everyone being here, and we hope to see you next Thursday. All right, thanks everyone.
Yep, thanks.